The great council chamber of the Galactic Concord floated in the empty space between three dying stars. It was a station the size of a small planet, built by races that had mastered the secrets of the universe long before Earth's first fish crawled onto land. Inside its walls, the rulers of 1,000 worlds gathered to decide the fate of species. Ambassador Elias Vance sat in his assigned seat at the far edge of the chamber. His chair was smaller than the others. His platform was lower. From where he sat, he had to look up at everyone else. This was not an accident. The architects of this room had designed it to remind humans of their place. He did not complain. He never complained. He simply watched. The Velith delegate floated nearby, its body made of living crystal that caught the light of the artificial suns above. It was ancient beyond measure, and it looked at Vance the way a man might look at an insect on his dinner table. Curious, perhaps, but certainly not important. The Karak speakers sat in a cluster of 12, their minds linked together into a single thinking machine of flesh and bone. They did not look at Vance at all. To them, a species that thought with only one brain was barely worthy of notice. And then there were the Drathan. War Master Kethvol dominated the center of the chamber. He stood 3 meters tall, his gray skin covered in ritual scars that told the story of 100 victories. His people had been conquering worlds since before humans learned to make fire. They believed that strength was the only law that mattered, and they had the power to prove it. Today, like most days, the council was discussing which smaller species would pay tribute to which larger ones. It was an old system, older than humanity's entire civilization. The strong took from the weak accepted it or died. This was simply how the galaxy worked. Vance listened as the Velith Patriarch proposed new mining rights in a distant sector. He listened as the Koraks calculated the labor value of 3 conquered species. He listened as Kethvol demanded that 2 more worlds be added to the Drathan Dominion's territory. The smaller species in the room said nothing. They had learned long ago that speaking only brought attention, and attention from the powerful was rarely good. But when Kethvol pointed at a star map and claimed 3 human colony worlds as future tribute territory, Vance raised his hand. The chamber fell silent. Not from respect, but from surprise. The human was speaking. This was unusual. This was almost amusing. The Concord recognizes the human representative, the Velith Patriarch said, its crystal body flickering with something like curiosity. Vance stood. He was not tall. He was not impressive. He wore simple clothes, carried no weapons, and showed no signs of the genetic engineering that made other species strong and fast and deadly. "I would like to register an objection," he said. His voice was calm and quiet. Kethvol turned slowly to look at him. The War Master's eyes were yellow, like a predator's, and they held the cold confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. "An objection," Kethvol repeated. The translator made the words sound like a joke. "From the humans." Laughter rippled through the chamber. The Korak speakers chittered. Even some of the smaller species allowed themselves small smiles. It was safe to laugh at humans. Everyone did it. Vance waited for the laughter to stop. Then he spoke again. "The colonies you have named are home to 40 million people. They are not tribute worlds. They are not available for conquest. I am formally objecting to their inclusion in Drathan territory." Kethvol stepped closer to the human's platform. He moved like a creature that had killed many things and expected to kill many more. His shadow fell over Vance, blocking out the light. "Your kind has been part of this Concord for 60 of your years," the War Master said. "In that time, you have built nothing of importance. You have conquered nothing. You have contributed nothing. Your ships are slow. Your bodies are weak. Your lives are short." He leaned down, bringing his scarred face close to Vance's. "You are prey animals who learn to talk. Nothing more." Vance did not step back. He did not show fear. He simply looked up at the massive warrior and nodded slightly, as if considering the words. "I understand your position," he said, "but my objection stands." Kethvol stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed, a deep and terrible sound that echoed through the chamber. "Let the record show that the humans object," he said, turning away. "Let the record also show that no one cares." The council moved on to other business. The smaller species relaxed. The moment of strange tension passed, and everything returned to normal. But Vance did not sit down immediately. He stood for a moment longer, looking around the great chamber. He looked at the Velith, with their ancient knowledge and their absolute certainty that they understood the universe. He looked at the Corax, with their linked minds and their cold calculations. He looked at the Drathan, with their weapons and their hunger for conquest. And then he looked at his datapad, where he had been taking notes for 60 years. None of them had ever asked what he was writing. None of them had ever wondered what humanity was doing in its quiet corners of the galaxy, far from the attention of the powerful. They assumed that humans were doing what weak species always did, surviving, accepting, and waiting to be conquered. They were wrong. Vance sat down and continued to watch. He had learned more in this chamber than anyone suspected. He had learned how the Velith crystals grew and what frequencies shattered them. He had learned how the Corax hive mind communicated and what happened when those signals were jammed. He had learned how Drethan warships coordinated their attacks and where the gaps in their formations appeared. He had learned that the galaxy's great powers had not faced a real challenge in thousands of years. They had grown comfortable. They had grown predictable. They had forgotten that the universe was full of dangers, and that sometimes the greatest danger was the one you never saw coming. Back on Earth and on dozens of hidden stations scattered through empty space, humanity's greatest minds were working. They were building things that the Concord had banned long ago. They were preparing for a war that they hoped would never come. But if it did come, they would be ready. Vance made another note on his datapad and smiled slightly. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret that would change everything. The quiet human returned to his watching, and the galaxy continued to ignore him. The message arrived on a Tuesday Earth time. It came through official Concord channels, stamped with the seal of the Drathan Dominion, and it was addressed to every human government in existence. The message was simple. The Drathan were claiming 3 human colony worlds: New Cascadia, Port Haven, and the mining settlement of Frost Ridge. The populations of these worlds, totaling approximately 40 million people, would become labor castes in service to the Dominion. They would work in Drathan mines and Drathan factories. They would serve Drathan masters. This was not a request. This was not a negotiation. This was simply the way things were going to be. Humanity had 30 standard days to prepare for the transition. On Earth, the message was received in silence. Presidents and prime ministers read it in their private offices. Military commanders studied it in their war rooms. Scientists and engineers looked up from their hidden laboratories and waited to see what would happen next. Ambassador Vance read it in his small quarters aboard the Concord station. He read it twice, then set down his datapad and looked out the window at the stars. 40 million people. 40 million human beings who would become property. Children who would grow up as slaves. Families who would be torn apart and sent to work until they died. He thought about his daughter, who lived on New Cascadia with her husband and their 2 young sons. He thought about the messages she sent him, full of pictures of ordinary life, birthday parties, school plays, sunny afternoons in the garden. The Drethan would take all of that away. They would take it because they could, and because no one had ever told them they could not. Vance stood up and began preparing for the council session. The great chamber was full when he arrived. Word had spread quickly. Everyone wanted to see how the humans would respond to their first real test. Would they beg? Would they bargain? Would they offer something else in exchange for their people? The Velith patriarch watched with ancient curiosity. The Corax speakers calculated probabilities. The smaller species kept their heads down, grateful that this time it was not them. War Master Kethval stood in the center of the chamber, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He looked pleased. This was a good day for the Dominion, a new conquest, and not even a difficult one. Vance walked to his platform and stood there for a moment, looking around the chamber. He noticed that some of the delegates were already preparing to leave. They expected this to be quick. A few words of acceptance, perhaps some minor negotiation about transition timelines, and then everyone could move on with their day. The Concord recognizes the human representative, the Velith patriarch said. Vance took a breath. In his pocket, he could feel the weight of his datapad, filled with 60 years of observations. In his mind, he could see his daughter's face and the faces of her children. The United Human Coalition has reviewed the Drathan demand, he said. His voice was steady. We have consulted with our governments, our military commanders, and our people. Kethavol smiled. It was a predator's smile, full of teeth. And you have decided to accept, of course. It is the only sensible choice. No, Vance said. The single word hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. What? Kethavol's smile faded. We decline, Vance said. The colonies named in your message will remain under human control. Their populations will remain free. We will not provide tribute, labor, or territory to the Drathan Dominion. Not now, not ever. The silence that followed was unlike anything the chamber had ever experienced. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The translators hummed quietly, rendering Vance's words into 100 different languages, but still no one responded. Then Kethavol laughed. It started as a low rumble in his chest and grew into a roar that shook the platforms around him. Other Drathan in the chamber joined in. The Korak speakers chittered with what might have been amusement. Even the Velith Patriarch's crystal body flickered with something like disbelief. The human declines, Kethavol said, still laughing. The prey animal says no to the hunter. He stepped toward Vance's platform, his massive form casting a shadow across the small human. Do you understand what you are doing, little creature? Do you understand what will happen now? Yes, Vance said simply. We will send our fleet, 800 warships, each one capable of destroying a planet. We will burn your colonies until nothing remains but ash and memory. And then we will come for your homeworld, your precious Earth, and we will teach your entire species the price of defiance. Vance nodded. I understand. You understand? Kethavol's amusement was fading, replaced by something darker. Then why? Why would you choose death over service? At least as tribute species, your people would survive. Vance looked up at the towering warrior. In that moment, something changed in his expression. The quiet diplomat was still there, but beneath the surface, something else looked out through his eyes. Something very old and very patient. Because some things are worse than death, he said, and slavery is one of them. He gathered his materials and turned to leave the chamber. Wait, the Velith Patriarch called out. Its ancient voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. You cannot possibly believe you can survive this. Your technology is primitive. Your military is small. What do you think you can do against the full force of the Drathan Dominion? Vance paused at the door. He did not turn around. I think, he said quietly, that you will find out. And then he was gone. The chamber erupted into noise. The Drathan shouted for blood. The Koraks calculated the timeline for humanity's extinction. The Velith debated whether this was courage or simply madness. Within one standard cycle, the Drathan war fleet began to mobilize. 800 capital ships, each one larger than most species' entire navies. They were armed with singularity lances that could tear holes in the fabric of space itself. They were crewed by warriors who had trained for combat since childhood. They had never lost a war. The galaxy watched with mild interest as the fleet departed for human space. News networks ran commentary programs about the coming extinction. Scholars prepared to document the end of a young species that had reached too far beyond its place. Everyone agreed on one thing. It would be over quickly. On New Cascadia, 40 million humans looked up at their sky and waited. Some of them prayed. Some of them wept. Some of them simply held their families close and tried not to think about what was coming. And deep in the empty spaces between stars, far from any watching eyes, something else was waking up. Humanity had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Now finally they would show the galaxy what they had learned. The Drathan did not understand fear. They had bred it out of themselves thousands of generations ago, selecting only the bravest and strongest to continue their bloodlines. To them, fear was a weakness, a flaw found only in lesser species. Warriors did not feel fear. Warriors felt only the joy of battle and the hunger for victory. This was their greatest strength. It was also, as they were about to discover, their greatest weakness. Humanity had never stopped being afraid. While the elder races had grown comfortable in their power, Humans had remained terrified. They looked up at the night sky and saw not beauty but danger. Every star could hide a threat. Every shadow could contain something hungry. This was built into their bones, burned into their blood by millions of years of running from predators in the dark. When humanity reached the stars and found them full of species older, stronger, and more advanced than themselves, they did not relax. They did not celebrate their survival. They did not trust their new neighbors. They started planning. In the decades since first contact, while Ambassador Vance sat quietly in council chambers and smiled at alien insults, humanity had been working. They built research stations in the empty spaces between star systems, far from any trading routes or sensor networks. They studied every piece of alien technology they could get their hands on, not to copy it, but to understand how to destroy it. They ran simulations of every possible war scenario. What if the Velith attacked? What if the Korax decided to assimilate human populations? What if the Drathan came for their worlds? Each scenario was studied, analyzed, and prepared for. And they built weapons. The Galactic Concord had banned certain types of warfare long ago. Not because these weapons were cruel or immoral, but because they were too effective. They changed the nature of combat in ways that the elder races found uncomfortable. A single small ship should not be able to destroy a massive warship. That was not proper. That was not how civilized species fought. Humanity did not care about proper. Humanity cared about survival. In hidden factories on frozen moons and hollow asteroids, engineers worked around the clock. They built weapons platforms small enough to fit in a human hand and deadly enough to crack starship armor. They built jamming systems that could blind an entire fleet. They built fusion lances that could punch through shields designed to stop much larger weapons. And they built millions of them. The doctrine was simple: never fight fair. If an enemy brought one ship, bring 1,000 drones. If an enemy brought 1,000 ships, bring 1,000,000 drones. Overwhelm them with numbers. Confuse them with speed. Take away their ability to coordinate, communicate, and respond. Then destroy them in detail, piece by piece, until nothing remained. It was not honorable warfare. It was not glorious combat. It was the fighting style of a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars. It was the fighting style of creatures who had learned long before they reached the stars that the universe did not care about honor. The universe only cared about results. The Drathan fleet took 3 standard weeks to reach human space. 800 warships arranged in perfect formation emerged from hyperspace above New Cascadia. Their arrival was announced with the traditional Drathan War Declaration, a burst of energy that painted the sky with fire and told everyone below that their death had come. War Master Kethval stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion's Fist, and looked down at the blue-green world below. It was a pretty planet, he admitted, rich with life and resources. It would make a fine tribute world once the population had been properly disciplined. Begin scanning for defensive installations, he ordered. I want to know what they have before we start the cleansing. His sensor officers bent to their work. Long minutes passed. Then one of them looked up, confusion plain on his scarred face. War Master, there is nothing. Nothing? No defensive satellites, no weapons platforms, no military vessels in orbit. The officer checked his displays again. The planet appears to be empty. Kethval walked to the sensor station and looked at the readings himself. The officer was right. New Cascadia showed no signs of military activity at all. More than that, the cities below were dark. No power signatures, no communication signals, no movement. They ran, one of his lieutenants said, laughing. The humans abandoned their own world rather than face us. Other warriors joined in the laughter. Of course, the humans had fled. What else could prey animals do when the predator arrived? But Kethval did not laugh. He had fought many wars against many species, and something about this felt wrong. The humans had known for weeks that the fleet was coming. They had time to prepare defenses, to dig in and make the Drathan pay for every meter of ground. Instead, they had simply left? No, something was wrong here. Full sensor sweep, he ordered. Check the moons. Check the asteroid belt. Check everything within a light minute of this planet. The sensors reached out, painting the local space with active scanning beams. For a long moment, everything appeared normal. Empty space, dead moons, drifting rocks. Then one of the moons moved. It was a small movement at first, almost impossible to detect. But then another moon shifted position, and another. And then the asteroid belt came alive with 1,000 points of light, each one accelerating toward the fleet. War Master, the sensor officer said, his voice suddenly very quiet, I am detecting launch signatures. How many? The officer stared at his display. His hands were shaking. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. Millions. Kethval looked out the main viewport and saw the stars beginning to disappear, blocked out by an approaching cloud of tiny shapes. Each one was small, no bigger than a Drethan warrior. Each one was fast, accelerating at rates that would crush any living pilot. And each one was heading directly for his fleet. For the first time in his long life, the War Master felt something cold settle into his chest. It took him a moment to recognize the sensation. It was fear. The humans had not run. They had not surrendered. They had simply been waiting, with terrible patience, for the Drathan to walk into their trap. And now the trap was closing. All ships, Kethval commanded, his voice steady despite the cold in his heart. Battle formation. Prepare to engage. In the distance, the swarm drew closer, and the light of 1,000,000 fusion drives turned the darkness into fire. The first wave hit the Drathan fleet like a storm of angry hornets. War Master Kethval watched from his command throne as thousands of tiny weapon platforms slammed into his outer formation. Each one was barely visible on his displays, just a speck of light moving impossibly fast. The point defense systems of his warships tracked and destroyed hundreds of them, filling space with explosions. But for every drone they killed, 100 more took its place. Concentrate fire on the larger clusters, Kethval ordered. Do not let them reach the capital ships. His fleet responded with the discipline of warriors who had trained together for decades. Singularity lances carved great wounds through the approaching swarm. Plasma batteries filled the void with walls of fire. The Drathan gunners were the finest in the galaxy, and they fought with all their legendary skill. It was not enough. The drones did not attack the way any species had ever attacked before. They did not form lines or charges or any recognizable formation. They moved like water, flowing around obstacles, splitting apart when fired upon, then reforming behind the defensive fire. They seemed to communicate with each other, sharing information and adjusting their tactics faster than any organic mind could follow. And then they reached the communication relays. The Drathan fleet depended on a network of signals that linked every ship to every other ship. Commands flowed from flagships to cruisers to destroyers in seamless coordination. It was what allowed 800 vessels to fight as a single unit, responding to threats with perfect unity. The humans understood this. They had studied it for decades, and they had designed their weapons specifically to destroy it. The first jamming pulse hit the fleet like a physical blow. Suddenly, captains could not hear their admirals. Gunners could not receive targeting data from sensor stations. Ships that had fought together for centuries were suddenly alone, isolated, unable to coordinate. Panic spread through the ranks. Warriors who had never known fear began to feel something terrible growing in their hearts. The great fleet that had conquered 100 worlds was breaking apart, not from damage, but from confusion. Kethval slammed his fist against his command throne. Switch to backup frequencies, restore communications. His officers worked frantically at their stations, but every time they found a clear channel, the jamming shifted to block it. The human weapons were adaptive, learning from every attempt to counter them. They were not just machines, they were thinking machines, evolving their tactics in real time. And while the fleet struggled to communicate, the fusion lances began their work. The drones did not try to destroy warships with single massive strikes. Instead, they worked in coordinated groups, dozens of weapons attacking the same point on a ship's armor over and over again. They found weak spots, shield gaps, damaged sections. They carved through hulls with surgical precision, targeting engines and reactors and life support systems. The great warship Conqueror's glory was the first to die. Its shields flickered and failed under sustained assault. Its armor melted under concentrated fusion fire. When its reactor finally breached, the explosion was visible across the entire fleet. Then the Dominion's pride fell. Then the wrath of ancestors. Then a dozen more. Kethaval watched his fleet dying around him. Ships that had served the Dominion for generations were being torn apart by weapons smaller than a single warrior. It was impossible. It was humiliating. It was happening anyway. War Master, one of his officers called out, "The humans, they are not fighting like any species we have encountered. They are not trying to capture our ships or accept surrender. They are simply destroying everything." Kethaval understood now what he was facing. This was not warfare as the galaxy knew it. This was something older, something more brutal. This was the hunting strategy of a species that had learned, in the dark forests of their homeworld, that the only way to survive was to destroy your enemies completely. Leave nothing alive. Leave nothing to come back for revenge. The humans were not soldiers, they were predators. And the Drathan, for all their size and strength, were their prey. "All ships," Kethaval commanded, knowing even as he spoke that few would hear him. "Retreat. Fall back to hyperspace jump points. We must preserve what remains of the fleet." But retreat was impossible. The swarm had surrounded them now, cutting off every escape route. Ships that tried to run were chased down and destroyed. Ships that tried to surrender were ignored. The human weapons did not understand mercy. They had not been programmed for it. Hour after hour, the battle raged. The Drathan fought with courage that would be remembered in songs for generations. Warriors died at their stations, firing until their weapons melted. Captains went down with their ships, refusing to abandon their crews. Every warrior who fell took dozens of drones with them. But there were always more drones, always more fire, always more death. By the 6th hour, half the fleet was gone. By the 9th hour, only 100 ships remained. By the 11th hour, the Dominion's fist floated alone in a sea of wreckage, surrounded by the twisted remains of 800 warships and the scattered bodies of 1,000,000 Drathan warriors. Kethaval stood on his damaged bridge, looking out at the destruction. His ship was dying. Fires burned in the lower decks. The life support was failing. Most of his crew was already dead. He thought about his ancestors, who had conquered stars and built an empire that lasted for 10,000 years. He thought about the generations of warriors who had served the Dominion with pride and honor. He thought about everything his people believed about strength and weakness, about predators and prey. They had been wrong about everything. He walked to the communication station and began to transmit. He did not know if anyone would hear him, but he had to try. He had to let the galaxy know what had happened here. "This is War Master Kethaval of the Drathan Dominion," he said, his voice steady despite the smoke filling his lungs. "The human species is not what we believed. They are not prey. They were never prey. They simply waited and watched and let us believe what we wanted to believe." He paused, coughing blood. The ship shuddered around him as another section lost power. "Do not make the mistake we made. Do not ignore the quiet ones. Do not assume that silence means weakness." He looked out at the approaching swarm, now closing in for the final kill. "They remember everything, and they do not forgive." The transmission ended as the drones reached the bridge. In the great council chamber of the Galactic Concord, the message was played for the assembled delegates. The Velith Patriarch's crystal form flickered with emotions it had not felt in millennia. The Korax speakers fell silent, their linked minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. And in his small seat at the edge of the chamber, Ambassador Vance sat quietly, watching, and waited to see what would happen next. The galaxy held its breath and waited for humanity to conquer. It was the obvious next step. The humans had revealed themselves to be the most dangerous species anyone had ever encountered. They had destroyed the mightiest military force in known space in less than a single day. Their weapons were still out there, drifting through the darkness, waiting for new targets. Nothing could stop them now. The Velith began calculating surrender terms. They had ruled the Concord for 12,000 years, but they were practical creatures. If humanity wanted their territories, their resources, their very bodies, the Velith would give them willingly rather than face the fire. The Korak speakers debated whether to flee to distant stars or simply accept absorption into whatever empire the humans chose to build. Their calculations showed no scenario where resistance was viable. The only question was how to minimize losses. The smaller species, those who had lived under the tribute system for countless generations, felt something they had almost forgotten: hope. If humanity destroyed the Drathan, perhaps they would destroy all the other oppressors too. Perhaps the old order was finally dying. Everyone expected blood. Everyone expected conquest. Everyone expected the quiet humans to become the new masters of the galaxy. They were wrong again. Ambassador Vance returned to the council chamber 3 days after the battle. He wore the same simple clothes he always wore. He carried the same datapad he had carried for 60 years. He walked to his small platform at the edge of the room and stood there, looking out at the assembled delegates. The chamber was very quiet. No one laughed this time. "The United Human Coalition wishes to address the Concord," Vance said. The Velith Patriarch spoke carefully, its crystal body dimmed with uncertainty. "The Concord recognizes the human representative." Vance looked around the room. He saw fear in faces that had never known fear before. He saw powerful beings trying to make themselves small, hoping to avoid notice. He saw the same behavior he had seen in smaller species for decades, directed now at him. He did not enjoy it. "Humanity did not come to the stars looking for an empire," he said. "We came because we were curious. We came because we hoped to find friends, allies, species who might help us understand the universe a little better." He paused, letting his words settle into the silence. "What we found instead was a system built on domination. The strong crushing the weak, species treated as property, billions of beings living in fear because that was simply how things worked." He shook his head slowly. "We could not accept that. We would not accept that. So we prepared." The Korak speakers stirred. One of them spoke, its voice trembling. "You could have warned us. You could have shown us your power and demanded change peacefully." "Would you have listened?" Vance asked. "Would anyone in this chamber have taken humanity seriously if we had simply asked to be treated as equals? We tried that. We were laughed at." He looked at the empty section of the chamber where the Drathan delegates once sat. "We did not want to fight, but we would not be slaves." A new figure stepped forward from the shadows. She was Drathan, tall and scarred like all her kind, but she wore the robes of a diplomat rather than the armor of a warrior. Her name was Vethkara, and she had been sent from her homeworld to represent what remained of the Dominion. "You killed 1 million of my people," she said. Her voice was controlled, but anger burned beneath the surface. "You destroyed our fleet. You humiliated our entire civilization. And now you stand here and speak of peace?" Vance met her eyes without flinching. "Yes. Why should we believe you? Why should anyone believe you? You have shown what you are capable of. What stops you from doing it again?" "Nothing," Vance admitted. "Our weapons are still out there. Our factories can build more. If we wanted to destroy the Drathan Dominion, the Velith Empire, the Korax Collective, we could do it. Maybe not easily. Maybe not quickly, but we could do it." The chamber tensed. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The threat, the demand, the new order imposed at the point of a weapon. Instead, Vance sighed. "But what would be the point? We would become exactly what we hated. We would build an empire on fear and force, and someday another species would rise up and destroy us the same way we destroyed your fleet." He shook his head. "That is not what we want. That is not who we want to be." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small data chip. He held it up so everyone could see. "This contains a proposal for a new galactic Concord, one built on genuine equality, not domination, one where tribute is replaced by trade, one where every species, regardless of size or strength, has a voice that matters." He set the chip on his platform. "We are not asking for power. We are asking for partnership." Vethkara stared at him for a long moment. Her scarred face was unreadable. "You killed our war master," she said finally. "You killed our fleet, and now you offer us friendship?" "I offer you a choice," Vance said. "The same choice we wanted for ourselves. The right to determine your own future without someone stronger forcing you to submit. He looked around the chamber. We offer that choice to everyone here. Join us in building something better or continue as you were. We will not force you either way. The Velith Patriarch's crystal body flickered with something like wonder. You truly do not want to rule? Vance smiled slightly. It was a tired smile, the smile of a man who had carried a heavy burden for a very long time. We want to go home, he said simply. We want to raise our families without fear. We want to explore the stars without wondering which species will try to enslave us next. We want to be left alone. He paused. But we will not be left alone as long as the galaxy is built on conquest. So we are asking you to help us change it. The debate that followed lasted for weeks. There were arguments and accusations and old hatreds that did not die easily. But in the end, the new Concord was formed. The tribute system was abolished. The banned weapons remained sealed away, though everyone now knew they existed. And Ambassador Elias Vance finally went home. He landed on New Cascadia on a warm summer evening. His daughter was waiting for him at the spaceport, her sons running ahead to hug their grandfather. Behind them, the sun was setting over cities that had been dark with fear just weeks before. Is it over? His daughter asked, holding him tight. Vance looked up at the sky where the stars were beginning to appear. Somewhere out there, automated sentinels continued their eternal patrol, watching for threats that might never come. Nothing is ever truly over, he said, but I think we earned a little peace. In the quiet corners of the galaxy, humanity continued to watch. They smiled at their neighbors. They traded fairly. They kept their promises, but they never stopped being afraid, and they never stopped preparing. Because the universe was vast and old and full of dangers, and the quiet ones had learned long ago that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance. The stars burned on, indifferent to the small creatures that crawled between them. But those creatures had learned to burn back, and that made all the difference.